We move to the next presentation, will be the final presentation in the session 2 on advances in phenotyping capabilities. And so Kenny Rutherford, who chaired the ethical board in the SmartCow project, will give us a talk about ethics and implementation of 3R on cattle experiments. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Renee. Good morning, everyone. So, yeah, as Renee said, my goal is to tell you a little bit about some of the progress that's been made during the SmartCow project in relation to the 3Rs. I should, of course, immediately note I'm really just a conduit for this information. The people who actually conducted the work that's relevant here and then had to explain it to me are largely those listed here. So thank you to everyone. A lot of you are here. So Renee said right at the start that one of the clear goals in SmartCow was to give due regard to 3Rs, to ethics and to animal welfare in the sorts of research we're doing. That's reflected in some of the text from the original proposal that talked a lot about the way that working together in the consortium might bring benefits in terms of standardising approaches and thinking about these areas in ethics as in other areas of our research, and also that would contribute both in research but outside of it in agriculture to improvements in health and welfare, with the ultimate goal of improving how society in general views the ethical acceptability of both research and to some extent agriculture. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the research projects. I mean, actually, we've heard a lot from Chris, from Cecilia and Isabel about some of the things I'll talk about. There have been some other activities during SmartCow in this area. Rai conducted some training courses, primarily focused at early career researchers. And the ethical board also did appraisals of all the TNA proposals that came in. And we've published, or are in the process of publishing, 2 chapters in the Book of Methods that will be open access from Isabel and from Yang Langbang that discuss different aspects of the ethics of using cattle in research and more generally about ethical approval processes. But of course, turning to the 3Rs, we're all very familiar with the idea that the work that we do should be judged on the basis of the balance of the benefits of that work to the harms that we impose on the animals that are within our studies. And for many decades now, going back to the original publication by Russell and Birch in 1959, the primary route for a lot of that consideration has been with regard to the 3Rs. You can see the 3Rs here: replacement, reduction and refinement. We're all very familiar with those concepts. The text here really just some quotes from that original Russell and Birch publication that highlights replacement as the substitution for conscious living animals of insentient material, reduction being the reduction in the numbers of animals used to attain information of a given amount and precision. And I think that's an important point. That second part of reduction is our goal there is not to reduce per se, but to reduce to the appropriate minimum that's necessary for the experimental studies that we're conducting. And similarly, refinement was defined by Russell and Birch as any decrease in the incidence or severity of inhumane procedures applied to those animals which still have to be used. And of course, nowadays we tend to think of refinement in a much broader sense as being any of the many ways that we could improve welfare in the animals during our study. So not just how we apply procedures directly with the animals, but wider issues to do with their housing, management and husbandry. Why are we interested in the 3Rs? Well, of course, we all as animal researchers have an ethical responsibility for the sentient animals that are under our care during research studies. Of course, that also comes in most instances with some clear legal obligations to attend to the 3Rs. And both of those aspects are really part of that wider process where we maintain or increase the societal acceptance of the research work that we do. And another example that maybe we don't often think about, but we have some nice examples of, sort of Chris mentioned it a little bit in his talk, is that in many instances, by paying attention to the 3Rs, we may also actually improve the quality of research that we are doing. So just some of the examples that I'll talk about in terms of what's happened during SmartCow. As I say, we've heard a lot about some of these aspects in the preceding talk, so I won't necessarily go into a lot of depth, but I'll say a little bit about some of the improvements in housing, improved procedures, particularly the proxy work that we heard about earlier, welfare assessment work, we heard a bit about that just now from Isabel, and also I'll say a little bit about some of the work in relation to fistulated cows. So when we think about housing, we're all familiar with the idea that for any captive animal, the physical and social environment that they're maintained in is a really critical determinant of their welfare. But of course, in the sort of work we've heard about today that's been proceeding in SmartCow at the various partner organisations and sites, often there's an extra step involved which involves processes for data collection, for sampling of animals, and that involves quite close confinement and quite severe elements of behavioural restriction in a way that's necessary to get the data that we require. So a number of SmartCow infrastructure sites have made clear advances over the period of the project in housing conditions. We've heard about some of this already. This is a picture of the new digestibility stall at INRAE. This is a number of important features that contribute to improved welfare, both the flexibility that we've heard about in terms of the size of the stall, also options that increase cow comfort, and also some aspects of the stall that are flexible and increase accessibility for humans, and the human safety element is important in all these housing systems. We've also, I think you've seen these pictures already from Chris, and he mentioned in a bit more detail the improved facilities that they have at Reading. I think particularly interesting the observations about how increasing cow comfort through the use of the water beds has also improved data quality, which may have also knock-on consequences for other aspects of the 3 Rs, particularly reduction or refinement. And finally, at Aarhus, a couple of new facilities, either loose housing systems for fistulated cows or new respiration chambers. Those of you that saw any of the film that was on during the break will have seen Peter in some of those systems with his cows. So again, these systems have a lot of the same features that are improving welfare, paying some attention to social aspects for the cows, allowing some degree of social contact, accessibility both for cows and people, and flexibility in terms of how the housing facilities are set up, and attending better to comfort, particularly comfort for lying and standing in terms of the substrates. Moving on to some of the improvements in procedures. So Gonzalo provided me with this slide. I'm not going to go into any level of detail about this at all. We heard about it in much more depth from Cecile. Really just to point out again that a lot of this work in relation to proxies has this ultimate goal of either avoiding or at the very least reducing the level and duration of constraint, the behavioural restriction that's required as part of these studies. It's also true to say that I think one of the other knock-on goals of this sort of work might be to take some of our research work out of the very constraining research environment into more commercial practice. And this may have other benefits for limiting the harms that we impose on our animals in research, and also increasing the relevance and of the data that we collect. I think we also heard a little bit, I think Chris referred to some of this work. One of the other ways that we can think about refining the experience of animals in our research conditions, particularly in these sort of close confinement and restraint settings, is looking at duration. So we had a bit of a discussion about that following Chris's talk. So there's been some work at INRAE, again, looking at both the implications of duration on the quality of the data. Chris showed some of those, some of that information in his talk, but also from Isabel and others looking at the implications for welfare, looking at stress hormones, cortisol as a stress hormone, and also behavioural indicators of how animals are adapting or not to periods of confinement, for instance, in a digestibility stall. So the data you can see here is just some of the behavioural data, a very simple metric of standing behaviour that appears to show in line with the cortisol results that cows are experiencing some degree of stress when they're first confined in these settings. They then adapt and habituate to that setting, but then that disturbance kicks in again once sampling processes start. So again, this sort of places a clearer emphasis on us attending to and understanding the implications of different durations of sampling in the sorts of research studies we're doing. Across all of the partner organisations, and again Chris referred to it in his talk, there's been a number of different studies that have really addressed this issue of how short a duration might be appropriate for us to achieve our experimental goals in terms of refinement. But certainly approaches such as pre-housing adaptation to trial diets before the actual restriction kicks in, and also, as Chris noted, just a process of training and habituation to the research setting can be important as a refinement in this context. Again, I'm not going to say really anything about this because we've just immediately heard a talk in great detail from Isabel about it. Just really to note that this work in improving techniques for welfare assessment it applies both as a potential refinement of our research studies, but also as a way of translating out some of the research work into commercial practice ultimately. And clearly sensors are a great way of that we may be able to do this. But as Isabel noted in our talk, I mean, one of the benefits of sensors is we get a ton of information. Really the key issue is knowing what to do with it. And actually all the examples of the metrics that Isabel talked about is a great example of that we have to have that understanding of what we do with that data and what it means in terms of the cow's perspective on its life. Fistulated cows are, I guess, an ongoing issue and an ongoing point of discussion at many infrastructure sites across SmartCow. We know over very many decades that the use of fistulated cannulated cows has provided us with a lot of very relevant and important data in our field. But there are a number of outstanding welfare issues that are only partly addressed, perhaps, including particularly the issues to do with pain and its assessment around the surgical procedure at the start of the process, but also around the lifetime of these animals in research. They're often kept for long periods as research animals, and that may or may not be good or may or may not be appropriate for welfare depending on the circumstances that those animals are housed in. So as we improve housing facilities, maintaining individual animals as research study animals for long periods, sometimes years, may be appropriate. But there are these ongoing issues and a wider issue of public perception of this procedure that seems to be highly variable across different countries. But we have seen across some of the SmartCow partners either a move away from using fistulated cows already or in the near future. That's led to some clear efforts to try and develop alternatives to gain access to the same sorts of data we can get from using these cows, but in a different setting, and particularly within the SmartCow in Rye, there's been a lot of progress made in vitro fermentation approaches that allow a reduction in the use of experimental animals that are necessary to be used. Either those animals are necessary for fluid collection, or they can be used in studies where a more limited array of substances are being tested, the product of the prior screening in a lab environment. And there are a number of other explorations of other alternative ways of gaining data that we might be achieving from fistulated cows now, including laboratory approaches to looking at feed values, different ways of collecting fluid, rumen fluid for those in vitro studies, or the application of sensors again, although all of these approaches have their limitations and it's not there yet in terms of replacing fistulated cows in research. So to sum up then, I think when we think about the 3 Rs, I mean, clearly for all of us working with agricultural animals in our research, replacement it often is fairly limited and may not be something that will be progressed very greatly in the near future. Still some progress being made. We are seeing clear signs of improvements and progress being made in terms of things like reduction and refinement. Examples of this I've mentioned in the talk and we've heard about earlier today from within the SmartCow projects and research itself, such as the use of in vitro fermentation approaches, the whole work that Chris talked about in terms of understanding measurement error and variance in different contexts, I think is really important in terms of the implications it might have in the longer term for reducing animal numbers in future studies. Again, that reduction being with the aim of still gathering the data that we view as important and necessary, but minimising the number of animals needed to do that. And we've seen a number of examples of refinement, those examples from housing conditions, the proxy work, and also improvements in welfare assessment. So the impact for this, I think, in terms of the SmartCow work, there are a number of factors. We've heard a lot about data sharing, and I think that's important that we communicate well what each other are doing. For funders, there should be some reassurance that the public money that they're using to fund our work is also contributing to ongoing improvements in the 3 Rs. And I think it's important for other academics to be able to see that we can improve both the quality of our data while simultaneously improving welfare. And of course, I do just want to mention that we should often consider that the primary beneficiaries of a lot of this work are the study animals themselves. They're complex, social, sentient creatures that allow us to gather important data for our research. So I've mentioned that replacement is still some way off, and there are still a number of things that we need to progress in terms of the 3 Rs. And there are some challenges to implementation, particularly funding can often be difficult for large animals. And there is still a bit of resistance in the research community to some of the drive to improve these aspects of the work. Oops. So to conclude then, I mean, we can all hopefully agree that in a way the work we do research is the product of an implicit social contract between us and the public that's based on the idea that we will only use animals when it's necessary, and we will minimise what happens to those animals and how many animals we use. But I think the SmartCow work does show that it's possible to conduct high-quality science while also continuing to improve study animal welfare. In fact, often that these two things can go hand in hand. So on that positive note, I will thank you for your time this morning, and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Kenny, for this very nice overview of different aspects we try to cover in the SmartCow project. This, I'm sure, will stimulate some questions from the audience or from the chat. Michel?
Yes, thank you for this talk. Actually, I have two questions. For the reduction of animals, do you think that the reuse of documented samples could be one option? And the second question about in vitro phenotyping, the example you gave was in vitro fermentation, but what about in vitro cellular models for functional studies? How do you think we could combine both in vitro, in vivo, to better match the 3 Rs?
Yeah, so in answer to your first question, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's both another benefit potentially of the SmartCow consortium, and something that's always important, I think, in research, that we can reuse samples and data where that's possible. We heard a lot this morning about data sharing, and I think that's another way that we may be able to actually avoid animal use or minimise it by making better use of the data that we all have, and we may actually be able to apply new research techniques to some of the data that we have. So actually there may be many of us who have large banks of sensor data that would be applicable to the sorts of analysis methods that Isabel's mentioned, that would avoid us conducting new studies across the board. The second part of your question, I'm absolutely not the person to answer that. I don't know, Renee, or maybe somebody else would be more appropriate.
I'm not sure to be the good person to answer this question, Michel, but this work on cell organisms was not in the scope of SmartCow, but I completely agree with you. It's an important aspect we have to deal with in combination with in vivo studies, of course. Are there other questions? We had a few days ago a stimulating workshop organized by the Pig Web about can we suppress completely?
Yeah, the title of the workshop was "Do we need experimental research if we have big data?" And the idea is, well, perhaps you know that the European Parliament voted not last September or so to ask the European Commission to make an action plan to ban animal experimentation. So what does that mean for us in terms of research infrastructures? What does it mean for young scientists, for which we now think they have research tools, but maybe 20 years from now they no longer have? So can we do animal research without animal experimentation?
Yeah, that's a big question, and not one I'm probably about to answer. I mean, I think my first gut reaction to that is that yes, we have big data, but that big data is often very narrow, and particularly from an animal welfare perspective, I think we are still a relatively young science, and I think we will be looking at, there's still a lot that we need to know about welfare that involves, and health, and probably in a whole load of other traits that involves, live animals in our research, particularly where actually the beneficiaries of that research are are animals themselves. So I guess, who knows what we'll be discussing in 20 years' time in relation to how we use data. It will be radically different from where we are now because, we are radically different now from 20 years ago, radically different. But I struggle to see a situation where we wouldn't be using animals in a lot of studies because of that sort of capturing that whole diversity and complexity of these, living systems.
But do you think that, because we've had access to animals and animal experimentation, and if we have a question, perhaps our first idea is to do an experiment rather than going back to all the literature and see is there anything in it, huh? And is it the fact that it's so simple to do experiments, so simple, even though it's getting more complex now. But if we were forced to first justify every detail of doing experiment because it was never done before, would that change?
So yes, I think it's a really good point, and actually, I think Chris sort of alluded to this, that there's a certain, we sometimes as a community forget things that we probably knew in the past, and we may have done work that's relevant to that. Actually, I would say often, and again, I'm thinking sort of from an animal welfare research perspective, and it would be interesting to hear if Isabel agrees or disagrees. I think we sometimes have the opposite problem, that we fail to replicate and attempt to replicate studies often enough. I think probably in some of the animal science areas that we've heard about this morning, in feed efficiency, methane emissions, and that there is clear attempts to replicate studies across a number of different sites. That's not true for all forms of animal science, and actually a lot of what we think we know about animals sometimes only comes from individual studies. So I think in a way, that's a bigger concern that I often have about the translation of what we think we know about animals to commercial practice and to that relevance, is that sometimes we don't replicate those studies, or we don't attempt to replicate them rather than that we don't actually replicate them.
Okay, thank you. Just a short comment because we have to move. Michael?
I was just going to ask Katie, I'd just like to get your view on the future of fistulated animals in research activities. France is not the world now, guys.
So many of you will be aware. I had an MSc student who did a project in relation to fistulated cows, gathered information from a lot of you about their use. I haven't really spoken about that, but one of the things that came out of that, I think, most strongly was there's a huge amount of variability in what people are doing. So even within SmartCow, within the sites that had or have fistulated cows within SmartCow, there's a huge amount of variability in what people are doing. So I think actually a lot of the future, so I can't speak to the issue of alternatives and their scientific credibility and all of that. So, that's not my area at all. But looking at it from the outside, I think there are some clear welfare issues that need to be resolved or could be better managed, and that often individual sites that are using these animals have done that, but that's not necessarily been communicated out to other researchers in the field, both within SmartCow, within Europe, or worldwide. So I think actually we would view the welfare of these animals as being a good level of welfare is probably achievable if we really concentrate a lot on maximising that at the time of the initial procedure and then through the life of that animal. We've talked about this in previous meetings, and some people, Dijkstra and Peter, I think, have both said, that, and maybe other people as well, I'm forgetting who I'm citing here, but I've said that, a lot of these cows are managed as normal cows and actually have equivalent welfare and health in research herds. So they may not actually be the welfare, from a welfare perspective, the priority that they're perceived to be. It's perceived as a very, at least in some circles, as a very artificial way of dealing with a living animal. But I think that issue of communication and identifying ways of optimizing welfare would be really important, and also actually just doing a bit more work on some of those issues, because actually there's almost no literature. There's a little bit in that area of pain assessment and pain management. There's some work from INRAE, there's some work from, I think, Guelph. Natalie Newby did a study on analgesia, but there's very little that have just treated it as a topic for welfare assessment in its own right. They're just sort of there in a lot of research sites and managed long term in those sites without necessarily that communication about what's how we optimize management. So I don't know about the prospects for replacement. It still seems fairly distant in some respects, but I think we can all be doing a lot more to share information and therefore manage welfare better in them, and that if we do that, they can have equivalent welfare to other animals in our research studies or even in commercial herds.
So, thank you. I think we will continue this discussion during the roundtable. And on fistulated cows, I think it's not only a welfare issue, it's also a problem of social acceptance by the society.